Kenneth to start. Outline the problematic for us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mandaza, and I really appreciate being invited to this very important platform, which I think in many ways helps us to shape the national narrative, but also to allow structured conversation on issues that are pertinent in our quest for transformation. I really appreciate to share the stage with such eminent persons who are very knowledgeable of many contexts, both from their own experience, but also from their interactions. I'm glad that when you introduced the whole session, you confirmed that we are not going to solve the problem. This really is a relief for me, because then I know that what we are doing here is a very humble contribution to a very complex situation in which we find ourselves in. When the title "Crisis" was put forth, I saw that there was already a lot of debate on whether we are in a crisis, and the way you
sound like Becky.
Yes, actually, I recalled the 2008 Thabo Mbeki statement that Zimbabwe is not in a crisis, and I think this is where maybe the conversation must begin on how do we determine where we are. But I think in your introductory remarks, you have been quite emphatic on how we can present the current situation. I think it can be more gloomy than you have presented it, and I think it's a fairly realistic description of our situation. The IGI Global Institute defines a national crisis as a situation or time at which a nation faces intense difficulty, uncertainty, danger, or serious threat to people and national systems and organizations, where there is a need for a non-routine devising of rules and procedures that must emerge, accompanied with a sense of agency. In a recent book by Jared Diamond, which has actually been recommended as one must read by Bill Gates, entitled Upheaval, Turning Points for National Crisis, I found a very interesting way to organize my thoughts on what I think needs to be done. In this book, Diamond analyzes how countries like Finland, Chile, Indonesia, Japan, Germany, and Australia have coped with the different forms of crisis. There are several critics who think that the crises in these countries were too different to be compared, and therefore this comparison is not very helpful. And there are others who also think that the way Diamond uses personal crisis psychology is not very helpful in addressing national crisis. With that critique in mind, I still think that the 12 points that he suggests could be indicators on whether a nation will cope with crisis or not, prove to be very helpful. I will not look at all the 12 because it will take the whole evening, But if we are looking at finding solutions, I think there are three that I would want to highlight, which I think would be helpful for organizing the different data that we come across with the experiences we are coming across with in Zimbabwe. First, Diamond indicates that a nation will be able to transform its crisis if it manages to build national consensus on agreeing that it is indeed in a national crisis. And I think this is the first and most important point. I think if we are going to find what we need to do is first and foremost to come to some form of convergence that actually we are in a crisis, and that we can find a common way to define that crisis together. And I think at the moment, this is one of the biggest challenges we are facing, is that there seem to be so many definitions of what problems we are facing as a nation. In the last few days, I've taken time to study the opening remarks at Lancaster House, and after reading the opening remarks of Lord Carrington, and then read the opening introductions of Joshua Nkomo in representing the Patriotic Front, and that of Abel Mzorewa, who was representing the leadership of Zimbabwe Rhodesia, I found it very interesting that actually they were defining the problem they were addressing at that conference in very, very different ways. And I realized that they were only successful because at the end of the day, with the help of the convening of Britain, at the end of the day, they managed to define the national question, and had initial agreement that led to our independence. The first step we need to take as Zimbabweans is to see how we are going to refine the national question together and agree on the way forward. The second issue that he suggests, which I also find relevant for Zimbabwe, is we need the need to accept what is our own responsibility. I know there is maybe going to be a reference to sanctions as a team on here, but one of the conditions that Diamond proposes is the need for a nation to take some responsibility, collective responsibility. Here, it will mean to say who will need to do what, where are we going wrong, and how can we correct. There are things that we are able to do ourselves as Zimbabweans before we can get help from anyone else. And I think we have so many examples of what kind of responsibilities we can take. Last but not least, from the 12 points, let me take what I think for me speaks to my constituents as a church. It's the question of rediscovering shared values and a shared national identity. And here, I think what we are looking is how do we recover values that will shape the way we deal with the past, as well as the values that will inform how we reimagine the future. Because I think this is where we are facing a very deep challenge. In my assessment, we are working with a completely different sense of the present. There are many people who have power, who have a sense that they are not sure how the future looks like, and therefore for them it's a moment to amass any resources they can for themselves, because they do not know what the future looks like. And such people cannot have a long-term focus on the solutions that are needed as a nation. There are those who are hoping that actually the situation is going to get worse and then finally collapse, and they think that they can pick the pieces from that. And we are then all put at the mess of those who are uncertain about the future and those who wish the future would be worse, in the hope that they could become the messiahs. If this is the situation, then we do not have common values that can direct the way we can reimagine the future. This would be my opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Kenneth, thank you very much. I think you have made the main points. The national question, how do you define it? I was at Lancaster, so remember those opening remarks. As a background boy, the collective responsibility and the reference to any insecure. You said it diplomatically. Insecure leadership. And one of the things that's driving corruption, of course, is insecurity. You don't know whether it will be tomorrow. It's still like hell. And then when you see the familiar case, then you realize if tomorrow it will be you. And that insecurity is what is been driving. And they say even the coup itself was all about this looting in part, yes. Just now, ready.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think for me, listening to what has been happening of late and the reports that we continue to get, demonstrating that we are getting deeper into the crisis. Basically looking at it from a human rights perspective, and also basically saying that it seems that human rights of citizens in Zimbabwe are at great risk at this moment. Despite the fact that we have a progressive constitution and we have an expanded Bill of Rights, it seems like we have a chef who has a buffet on a table, and they are deciding on what they will put on our table, on our plate, actually depending on their mood. But that's not how human rights are supposed to be enjoyed by citizens. And I think for me, what has really caught my eye is the fact that there is a lot of noise at the moment. A lot of noise about the abductions, the torture, and what is happening to people on a daily basis. I think if we look at the month of August alone, as the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, we have recorded 19 cases of abductions. If we go back to January, we recorded 26 cases. And between February and July, I think the cases kind of went down. We recorded about 5 cases. But I think what is more disappointing for me are the denials that are happening. That we find people being described in the most absurd way because they have spoken about being abducted and tortured. Abductions and torture are not new to Zimbabwe. They are also not new to, I'm not sure whether to call it the new dispensation, because for me I think they have gone back to factory settings. We are in the same system. And I find it very painful for someone who went through the same, that people can actually ridicule people who have gone through this heinous crime of abduction and torture. I'm really not sure what the victims are supposed to do for people to be able to hear that abductions and torture, they are going on. I visited Tatenda in hospital. It's sad that you find a young man who has lost his dignity. Because when I started talking to him, all he could say was, Sisi, I have nothing to be ashamed of anymore. You can come and see the blisters. He was opening up his backside. How does someone self-inflict? And then you look at Gonyeta's case, beating up her mother, minor children, seeing these masked men armed getting into a private home. Where are people going to be safe? Section 52 of the Constitution guarantees security of the person. But at the moment, all of us are not secure at all, because we don't know when that knock is going to come. And people talk about the police as if they are going to bring assistance that we have not seen in the past. Itai was abducted nearly 5 years ago. The police were supposed to investigate. I'm not sure if people have been able to get anything from that. Nothing. And all these people who have been said have reported to the police. They even have RRB numbers for the statements that they put to the police. But we have people talking about Gonyet having set out a skit. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not a skit, it's a reality. And I think it's just a question of time before it knocks at the different doors. And I think for me, like you said we will not get a solution today. I wish people would really stop making the noise that they are making and listen to what is happening. They do not have the pulse in terms of what is happening in communities. If they listened more, they would actually understand where we should begin. But there is so much noise that is going on. And at the end of the day, no one really feels what is going on. And so for me, I think that if we have less noise, we would actually be able to find a solution or maybe work towards a solution. And I'm also thinking that, I think Reverend Mutata touched on this, the issue of people failing to acknowledge what is happening. Unless we are able to acknowledge and not apportion blame to faceless third forces and third hands, we will not be able to deal with the problems that are before us. I would not even talk about a third hand or a third force, because I know that the system has done this before. What stops them doing it now? And I think what is also important is that rather than be antagonistic, and I think for this I'm also appealing to the opposition in DC. I think it is important that there is a bridging of the gap, because I think where we are now, the distance between people who are critical to this conversation is increasing. And what needs to happen is actually a bridging of that distance so that they are able to come to some agreement in terms of them beginning to speak. Because at the moment, people are just not speaking. And I think what I also see as our way of going forward, I will quote someone who said CSOs need to keep to their mandate. We are keeping to our mandate with the watchdog role. And we are going to shine the light into the corners where a lot of these things are happening. And I think we will bring up all the ills that are happening to Zimbabweans. And I think it is sad that when all this bickering is happening, at the end of the day, it's the common woman and the common man in the street who fails to feed their families. I think people saw a picture a few days ago of an apostolic faith man. I think he must be 69. We are finding a lot of families having to let their girls go in that way. Because we have these rich men and these prophetic men who are coming as if they are coming to help and exposing these children to a lot of challenges that in the future they will not be able to deal with. And I think I would say that's my introduction.
Thanks, Justina. Really, the room was silent to listen to you telling us what we're going through. I wanted to say also, acknowledge here your report, the new deception. Can't think of a better term. And which was launched on
Get a copy.
yes. And in doing so, also I want to acknowledge the role of the church and the international community. Timo, however you feel about the outrage of the state to your comments, ironically, those kind of statements that you've made have helped to highlight this abductions and so on. And there's been a lot in a few days. It's mainly because of the international outrage at these killings. And we also know that the killings, the massacre of 1st of August and the killings in January and these abductions will have imposed enormous pressure on the regime. And thirdly, the denials, are they denials or the statements of people who are helpless within the state? If I said earlier on that the state is no longer in control, it's in a free fall, I might want to suggest that they don't even know what's happening among themselves. So we have a very critically bad situation. Let me give it to Timo now. Sorry, Timo.
All right, are we okay? Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you very much for the invite to Supper's Trust. Thank you very much, Igbo, for having me here. I think it's important that we have fora like this where we can discuss and exchange views and do that in all frankness and transparency. So I'm very happy to be invited here. I'm also honored to be here to share the podium with Justina and Kenneth, two persons who are working tirelessly in the interest of their country and for the future of Zimbabwe. So indeed, I'm honored to be here. And thank you very much for outlining that division of labor, Igbo, giving me the international side, because I shouldn't be meddling into internal affairs. So I've been personally and my institution have been recently been accused of running a partisan agenda, and I just want to say that, you know, obviously we deny that. We don't have any partisan agenda. We are not favoring any particular political party. Everything that, you know, myself and my colleagues have been saying in the recent days, our statement from last week, basically all of that is also reflected in the Constitution of Zimbabwe, on statements that we have heard from the government before, issues that have been highlighted in the Transitional Stabilization Program from last October, where there's a section on governance, there's references to human rights, so basically what we are referring to is, are the universal values of human rights that we have subscribed to within the UN framework, that Zimbabwe has also signed up to within the African framework with the African Union, and also that are also reflected in the Cotonou Agreement, which is then the agreement that binds Zimbabwe and the EU together as part of Zimbabwe as one of the African, Caribbean, Pacific countries. So these are our reference points. And we have voiced these concerns, obviously, in our discussions with the government. And so we have been taking these issues up, and they are well known. Indeed, the past events compelled us to come out in the open with a joint statement by the EU delegation and a number of other diplomatic missions last week, when we had serious concerns about these recent violations of human rights and civic liberties. It was all the more important for us to come out in the public, as this comes as a continuation of very, very troubled events that we have had during the past year here in Zimbabwe, and in Zimbabwe's case also reflected also in the past. From an EU perspective, and when we are talking about, you know, the international community, and obviously I can't speak on the behalf of the whole international community, but just as a representative of one of the institutions and one of the partners. Obviously we want Zimbabwe to succeed. I've seen all kinds of conspiracy theories about how we have an agenda of trying to foil efforts of making Zimbabwe prosper, and you know, all kinds of discussions about colonialism and imperialism. So you know, obviously these kind of pointers are smoke screens for you know, and attempts to divert attention from other issues. But the question is that why on earth would we even want Zimbabwe to fail? That is the question. And you know, we would see a prosperous Zimbabwe be an interesting partner in its own right, in matters of trade and investment, but also in terms of the stability and influence that it would have in the region, in the Southern African region and the continent as a whole. So that is our hope, and that's why we are partnering with Zimbabwe. We are directing quite significant amounts of development cooperation funding to that effect, and also that's behind that's also behind our political dialogue with the government and with other stakeholders, and that's also what we are trying then to achieve when we are coming out in the public and voice our concerns. You know, the agenda is to change behavior and change it in a way that is respectful for the principles, the values that both Europe and Zimbabwe subscribe to. One issue that is we were talking about also, I noticed that there was some discussion about the definition of crisis. Clearly there's a humanitarian crisis in Zimbabwe. roughly a third of the population will be in need of food aid. So the economic dimension is extremely important, but it's linked to the political dimension in the approach that the international community has. Politics and economy go hand in hand, and that's one of the reasons why, indeed, we are following quite closely the human rights situation in the country. Now, from an EU perspective, there's a lot of attention to quote-unquote sanctions that we call the restrictive measures. And I see that I have to over and over again emphasize that I fail to see how they will have, what kind of an influence they would have on the economic situation of the country. They are restricted, and they are the list of targeted individuals and companies that were on the list used to be much longer. And these days we have 2 individuals. That's the former presidential couple. Zimbabwe Defense Industries, that's the only company that is targeted. And then we have an arms embargo. It's pertinent to the situation that, because the reason why the restrictive measures were introduced in the first place in 2002 was related to the human rights situation and to the limitation of civic rights. And that's why, as a foreign policy instrument, that is unfortunately still topical, even though it's very limited in scope and therefore, from our point of view, doesn't have any economic effect on the country. On the contrary, the EU has a free trade agreement, quite a generous free trade agreement with Zimbabwe, the Economic Partnership Agreement. And in fact, whilst Zimbabwe has a huge trade imbalance, a big deficit in terms of imports and exports in general, in fact, it enjoys a surplus towards the EU. Zimbabwe is exporting more to the European Union than it imports. Unfortunately, it's just a fraction of the trade, it's a 5%. But it just shows, in my opinion, that these discussions about the economic effect of the restrictive measures are not well-based. Like I said, I can't speak on behalf of the wider international community. I don't have that mandate, but I just wanted to note that with all these discussions on the sanctions going on, the Transitional Stabilization Program in fact refers to ZIDERA. It's giving us one of the pointers when they're under the heading of good governance about issues to be tackled. So I've seen a big change in that discussion about how to relate to these measures that are part of the international community have taken vis-à-vis Zimbabwe. On the way forward, so we have been very much being supportive of the government reform agenda. We have been supportive of it politically and also through our development cooperation. We have directed funding to support, for example, bringing the secondary legislation in line with the Constitution. We have done this in full understanding with the government. We are operating full transparency in our development aid with different partners. The Ministry of Finance knows or should know exactly what we are doing and who we are funding. So there's no secrets behind that. So we have been supportive of this agenda. We would have been very much hoping that it would have been moving forward faster. We are seeing some movement now on the legislative agenda. We hope that there will be positive outcomes from the work that is under process, and indeed that the outcomes would be up to the spirit and the letter of the Constitution, because that's the whole idea. But at the same time, if you have constant news about human rights violations, I fail to see how it could be business as usual from a Western perspective. So it's not only about what is happening about the laws, but also how they are implemented and how they are followed. So that's quite important. There's also then the big issues about the debt that Zimbabwe has towards the international community. The European Union member states are among the biggest creditors to Zimbabwe. And it's also an agenda that we would want to move forward, because we would clearly want to see Zimbabwe to normalize its relations. But these questions revolving around arrears clearance and so forth are also being linked very much to this, both the economic side of the agenda and the political side of the agenda. Because clearly in the European capitals, attention is paid to what is happening in the country and what news are coming from the country. So that's why in my own engagements I've always been saying that please give us good news, and something that we can use also toward our domestic audiences to show that Zimbabwe is on a different kind of a path. So I'm still hopeful that we will be moving on a more positive trajectory, which would then open up all kinds of opportunities. Only from the European perspective, we have the whole financing around development is moving away from the traditional grant aid towards different kind of loan and guarantee mechanism to support the private sector. And these are quite substantial. Now Zimbabwe is missing out on these, not because of any sanctions or restrictive measures, however you want to call them, but because of the arrears issue and the debt issue, which then makes it impossible for these instruments to be used. This is a very important time in EU-Zimbabwe relations, because we are starting to plan ahead for the next multi-annual financial framework of the European Union. That's the big multi-annual budgetary framework, which then covers the whole of Union's finances, and development cooperation is part of it. So we are soon entering in a phase where we are going to plan about how our cooperation will continue and what ways and means are we using with different countries. So this is a process that is starting, and what is happening in Zimbabwe is of course relevant for that process when we are thinking about our further cooperation. What is important, because it's multi-annual, is that whatever decisions we are now taking in the next approximately a year or so will then guide our cooperation for many years in the 2020s and in the future. So we are living in quite important times. So all of these issues are interlinked, and we from the international community are following quite closely what's happening in the country. When we publicly, and just to re-emphasize, when we publicly voice our concern, when we privately voice our concern, it is basically in the hope that we would see a more positive trajectory in the country. Maybe I'll leave it at that as introduction. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Timo. So, before we open the discussion, just 3 points. The first is the repeat of what I see as problematic for us. If we accept, as I've indicated, that we have a state in disarray, a state in decline, a fractious state, suggesting that maybe there is no one in control. And that at one level you got to have fractiousness growing, warlordism possible in such a situation. And I was suggesting to Justina that it's not so much denials. I thought those denials were very lame. It was, for me, it reflected people who are not in charge, who know what's happening. If that's the position, how do we move forward? Without making dialogue an industry. It becomes meaningless. Huh? Who do you talk to if you want dialogue in the state? Who is there to talk to? Even the military is visible only in the manner in which it beats out violence. But who in the military shall we talk to? for those who want to engage in dialogue. So we have a problem. At the same time, we cannot stand by in the face of growing violence. How do we stop the kind of outrageous things happening? How do we stop that? It must be stopped. How do we get everybody, international community, all ourselves, to ensure that citizens are not abducted at night, beaten up, killed? How do we stop that? The third, of course, is that this dialogue is part of a process which some of us are engaged in, and I hope that Britt Bomba says something in the course of the discussion. We are going towards the National Citizens Convention, which was postponed precisely because of the happenings, abduction. Some of our members were abducted. Mukono there was one of the victims. And we could not do what we were supposed to do end of August. So, but we are proceeding with the National Convention as part of this quest for a solution to our problems. But more important, how we can put on the ground a format as to the nature of the dialogue and the objective of the dialogue, so that we put some, whether it's a Lancaster House type, whether it's a Sudanese type transitional authority, whatever, something has to be done. And how do we bring the international community and the region together, even though the region is disarray? We have to continue trying to see how we can engage them. So I invite your questions, comments. We have half an hour, at the end of which my panelists will talk. Don't ask them difficult questions.
Yes,
They're not here to answer questions.
Yes.
What to be done? Begin with Mukono.
Thank you.
Identify yourself.
I'm Kai Dikon,
Yes.
the youth chairperson of the Crisis Zimbabwe Coalition. And I think that the fundamental question that confronts us at this moment is how do we resolve the outstanding issues emanating from the military coup of November 2017? Because what I see and I think is generally shared is that we now have an entrenched military elite that is determined, in my view, in commodity brokerage, be it in gold, diamond, oil, and fuel. So literally, because our economy is so tiny and is basically dependent on commodities, and most of it, what we have is basically minerals. That's why they go all out there and say. And if you look at it, the pattern is that all of these top military people and people within the hierarchies in government have interests in mining, have huge interest in the fuel industry, have huge interest in diamonds. So when you have such kind of a scenario, for them, governance has nothing to do with service delivery. That's why I'm telling you, you have a surplus that can't buy gloves for doctors just across the road in Parena. They have to wait for the same sanctions countries that are imposing them through SID, EU, and TFID to fund their own hospitals and education. Because for them, it's about the last supper, what Comrade Mandas was saying, that they are there to eat, to simply enjoy. So it's the last supper mentality for them to say, this is the moment, let's have it, and have it all. So I think that is where we really have a fundamental problem. And when you then look at human rights situation, I was recently arrested, I was over-detained, I went to court, hoping to get justice. The magistrate said, so the constitution was read to him. It's very clear in terms of section 52, I think, where it says that the right of an accused person who has been detained, if you are over-detained beyond 48 hours, the court must simply release you. They don't have to listen to the charge that the theft was. But there was a magistrate who said, one of the most confusing judgments that I've ever had in my entire life. This was what he said. He said, because of the nature of the charges of the accused person, we cannot release him, even if he has been over-detained. Because of the nature of the charges, he cannot be released. He agreed. The state paper said I was arrested at 11 a.m. on Thursday. I only appeared in court at 3 p.m. on Saturday. Clearly within 4 hours of over-detention. It's written on the state papers. It's acknowledged by the state that the accused person has been over-detained. But the nature of the charges cannot allow me to release it. And the charges are that I tweeted sometime in January, that let's join hands to show our anger with what is happening, and either the government solves our issues or they simply resign if they fail to do so. That is the charge. But it said because of that nature of the charges, they cannot release me, even after my rights have been clearly violated. And they acknowledge it. It's not like they're denying it. There's written on the papers that we've violated, but we are going to do that. So I think we really have to have a dialogue, and that dialogue is going to happen. It is very sincere. And the sincerity starts with, I think, Nangaba acknowledging that he's not in charge. I don't think he's in charge. I doubt that he's in charge. And that we have to go back to say, the guys and comrades who rolled out tankers and removed the Mugabe and all celebrated. What are your interests in respect of this country going forward?
Thank you. Excuse me. My name is Sisi Dangaremo. I'm an artist, a writer, and a filmmaker. And I'd really like to thank Ivo for having asked me to be suggested to me that I become part of the platform, the Concerned Citizens platform. And I would just like to add on to some of the things that have been said here. My assessment of the situation as someone coming from outside the politics, the humanitarian aspect, is that we are actually not engaging at all the levels and in all the areas that we should be engaging in. We talk about human rights, we talk about trade, we talk about all these things, but I haven't yet heard anyone say the people. We are talking about human rights, but who are these human rights being violated upon? We look at ourselves here. This is a national, a policy dialogue forum, which would like to have national repercussions. How many are we here? Are we asking ourselves how we engage with the people? All right, we have the media, but the role of the media is to depart information. It is to be objective, it is to be balanced. Now, I would like to ask you, is information the thing that determines how a person behaves? Somebody said we have to change behavior. Are we really assuming that information, as through the media, is what changes behavior? From where I'm coming from, also as a student of psychology, I would say no. Information is one of the last things that changes behavior. Information is useful insofar as it impacts on other aspects of human being, which is emotional aspects. Now we are talking about things like fear. We are talking about things like how we are able to process information. How many of you have had the situation that you're in an examination and you know that you've read, but because you're so nervous, you cannot process the information? Now these are things that have been going on in this country and we know about it. We had the national, what was it called, the Organ for National Healing and Reconciliation, and they were talking about these kinds of emotional, subjective impacts on people that have been going on for decades. And yet when we meet like this, we don't talk about them. The international community does not talk about them. The international community operating in Zimbabwe now does engage with artists, but which artists are they engaging with? Are they engaging with artists who can contribute to engaging with this symbolic level of where we live? Because you can give as much information as you want. You can have as many meetings here as you want. But if you are not able to talk to people at a level that speaks to them in their context, they are not going to change anything. And I also think we are having the same problem when we look at the government. We are saying, oh, it's a government in disarray. I beg to differ. It's not a government in disarray. It's a government that knows exactly what it wants. And it's doing exactly what it wants in order to get what it wants. And in order to do that, it has to keep us, the people, in certain situations of confusion, of unhappiness, of inability to do anything but manage to put food on the table today, because it knows that if we have better conditions, we will be able to do more. So I beg to differ, and I think that we have to have different ways, scenarios at which we look at our government today. Okay, it could be this. If it is this, then what do we do? It could be that. If it is that, then what do we do? But I feel that the whole thing that we are missing here is actually what makes humans act. And what makes humans act is what they want. So,
thank you, Steve. I'll come back to you. I'll ask Michael.
Thanks, Igor. We're very happy to be here. And thanks to Kenneth, Justina, and Timo for the very helpful remarks that you made. Like Timo said, my name is Michael Atingigo. I work for the Macroeconomic and Financial Management here in Harare. I'm not Zimbabwean. So like Timo said, I'm not competent to comment on what Kenneth and Justina said. So I'll just talk about economics and my understanding of how it works at international level, and trying to relate it to Zimbabwe to answer the question that we're trying to address. I came to Zimbabwe in September last year. From where I was coming, I was in Washington. And so come October, there was a monetary policy statement which distinguished between FCA and the USD, an acknowledgement that really the two are not equal, right? And then it was confirmed in, I think it was February, right, where the interbank market in FX was introduced, really to, and the governor said it's 2.5 to 1. So that was the issue. Now we've seen this slide to about 10, right, to 10 RTGs to $1 US. So that is begging a question for me. The question is, the Minister of Finance has been saying that they are running a surplus budget and what have you. So what has been going through my mind based on my experiences, then what has driven the exchange rates from 2.5 at the time it was announced to 10? There must be something not correct here. So really, if there is a fiscal surplus that they are talking about, then there's something else driving the exchange rate. And this is what I've been trying to ask myself. Is it a confidence factor? Is it politics? I'm not sure. So I look at the reform that the government has undertaken. It is very obvious that there was a lot of rent seeking, at least in February. There was a lot of rent seeking. By the time the government announced the 2.5 exchange rate, because at 1-to-1, the parallel market rate was anywhere around 3. So it means that those who had good connections and were getting $1 at 1-to-1 were making hefty profits by selling at 3. That is rent seeking. And if you look at the price of fuel, right, whereas in the region, fuel is likely priced at more than $1 USD per liter. If you had to use the parallel rate to convert the real price of fuel here, it was a few cents. So no matter how much money the government allocated for the importation of fuel, you never have enough fuel here because it is likely that it was filtering through. I don't know, but in economics, you know, when there's a profit to be made, people will do everything to see how to earn that profit. So now let's look at where we're today. Today, we have seen fuel is coming close to $1 per liter. And maybe the incentive to smuggle or to trade is being limited. Even those, you know, the rent seeking, those who are well connected, maybe are not making as much as they are making. So maybe there you reduce on the rent seeking behavior to some extent. But the fundamental question is, with all these reforms, the depreciated exchange rate, what are the social costs of this adjustment? How is that affecting the people? So I want to divide people into 3 categories. They're the well-to-do, they're the urban poor, and they're the rural poor. And I'm asking myself, who is the most hit among these 3 categories of people? Well, the well-to-do, maybe the top 5%, maybe are cushioning themselves through other ways and means. The rural poor are still subsisting, so maybe the impact is not as much as the urban poor. So my concern with the current reforms are that, whereas the reforms have been taken, the social cost, the what I would call the social safety nets to deal with the social cost of adjustments are not very clear. What is government doing about the people who are being impacted? Look at the rural poor, all right? The taxi fares have gone up, the food prices have gone up, the rent has gone up, the income has stayed the same.